Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Michael Murphy, a freelance journalist and documentary maker who writes for the Telegraph and other places. Now, Michael, thank you so much for joining Connor and me on Deprogrammed today.
Thank you for having me.
You've written you've written about all sorts of issues, and you've done documentaries about all sorts of issues, but recently, you wrote an article for the Telegraph about Ireland, where you made the point that Ireland's immigration nightmare, as you put it, isn't over yet. However, you also wrote that it is increasingly dawning on Dublin that unprecedented demographic transformation isn't actually very good for the Emerald Isle. Do you think that the political classes in Ireland are catching up with their people?
Yes, I think it took a while. It took a few things really to wake up Dublin 4, which is the part of Dublin where the government and media class tend to live. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest shock to the system was when a sprawling tent city, referred to by the Taoiseach as a shanty town, had just suddenly appeared in Dublin. I went there a few months before the international press came to document it to the chagrin of many politicians in Ireland. And it had completely metastasized along massive, sprawling Georgian streets where, essentially Dublin's chattering classes need to sort of walk around it and walk over it to get into work. And so I think it became impossible to ignore. Now, whether they're sincere in wanting to deal with the problem, that's another question. I think that they very much see it as a problem of capacity. They don't sort of appreciate the cultural arguments that one might make, or the various problems with crime and other things that we've seen around Europe. So I think that the Irish government are trying to find solutions to the capacity problem. Less so are they convinced that immigration is a massive problem, as we've seen in the rest of Europe.
That's interesting. What are the telltale signs that they feel this way? And by that, I mean the political classes in Ireland, not obviously the people's indignation is pretty well documented.
Sure. So Leo Varadkar, who really is the centerpiece to Ireland's immigration problems that have been rumbling on over the last 8 years, he's been in power for the longest time of any other politician during that period. He came out and said that the country growing by 2% per year was too high, and that everybody in Ireland, or most people in Ireland, felt this way, and they were right to feel that way. Now, that is quite a shocking admission that would have been unutterable by a Dublin politician just the previous year. Unfortunately, he said it when he was out of office and had sort of ceded the saddle to somebody else, and so too little too late from Mr. Varadkar. Simon Harris is in many ways
he's the present Taoiseach, right?
He's the present Taoiseach, and he is a slicker operator than his predecessor. He's very good at looking and acting tough on things like immigration, that he knows people want a slightly more muscular response from the government than they've had thus far. And so he said recently, about the sprawling shanty town that appeared in central Dublin, he said, this isn't a country where shanty towns are just allowed to develop, almost contradicting what everyone was seeing in front of their eyes. It seems that they're just not allowed to develop when the world's press are there, or if it's St. Patrick's Day or some other occasion where it could embarrass Dublin to have that flaunted in front of the world. He has started building these massive IPAS centres around the country. IPAS is international protection centres, essentially. And they essentially look like cargo containers that you'd see on a freight shipping line. And they look quite incongruous with the sleepy Irish countryside in which they're put. It's almost like seeing Guantanamo Bay in Tipperary. It's a very strange sight. So yes, I think that people are starting to wake up to the problem. As I say, they're seeing it as a capacity issue,
which is a problem because it's primarily, well, for us at least, and I'll let Connor come in now. But for me. Personally, and I suspect for the people of Ireland as well, that they'd be too scared to say it, it's the fact of demographic change, not the pace of demographic change, which primarily concerns them. And if the result is the same, it doesn't matter whether it's in 2080 or 2060, really, fundamentally, anyway.
Yeah, this has all the hallmarks of sort of political containment operation. I mean, to draw parallels with what we're seeing over here at the moment, lots of Conservatives who are happy to preside over the unparalleled levels of demographic change, which was as well 1% a year, and there's at least 1 to 2% of the country currently which are illegal migrants as well. They're now turning around and saying, that was a bit of a mistake, guys. We listened to the Migration Observatory Committee. We were derelict in our duty of ensuring that advisors advise and ministers decide, and maybe we should have got a handle on this, but we've lost power, so it's not really our fault. And then you see Labour. We've just had the Park Lane encampment dismantled in that exact rich and wealthy area where it's kind of an eyesore for the political class. Labour are now saying, oh, we'll get a handle on irregular, not illegal, irregular migration, meaning we'll regulate it and work out all the logistical challenges, because immigration is a foregone conclusion. It's just a matter of how can we accommodate these people we've already decided are going to arrive here. And they're cracking down on cash-only barber shops and nail shops where they're not getting any tax revenue. So it's the safe logistical option rather than the cultural, and that they would deem the racial-based option. Are you seeing a sort of attempt by the ruling Irish establishment who have created this problem to try and fold in immigration skeptic arguments to ensure that they remain in power and prevent a rising insurgent political movement? Because over here in the UK, we aren't seeing a rising insurgent political movement, other than Reform at the last election, who have since softened. Are they trying to contain this momentum, and is there any rising other option for the Irish people to vote for?
I think, unfortunately, there's no party to really hold the government to account on the immigration issue. And this is a very strange feature of Ireland, where it's got probably the most dynamic grassroots populist potential in Europe without a vessel to actually translate that into policy. There is really no immigration skeptic party. There's a smattering of independent MPs who have been Cassandras on this issue by calling it out for many years, but they don't really have any electoral clout as having a purchase on government. So I think that the Irish government are going to plough ahead with their working assumptions that Ireland has an aging population. They need people from around the world to supplement that labour shortage that they're envisaging over the next 50 to 60 years, and that they have what they term international obligations. Moral and legal obligations is the sort of platitude that is just trotted out to the Irish public whenever they question the feasibility of growing their population by potentially 2% a year, or 3.5 was the estimate last year. It has to be said that of the 100 to 180,000 people who arrived last year, anywhere between 15,000 to 50,000 could have actually been asylum seekers. We just don't know. The security services estimate it could be a lot higher than official estimates. So I think that they've thought and spoken in platitudes about migration for so long that their sort of ability to comprehend that there is another way, a third option, is very limited as far as I can tell.
Is there strong? I mean, I would argue that looking at the West more broadly now, and many people would argue that one of the reasons why replacement migration is such a temptation to the modern left is because if you replace a very settled demos with a sort of client xenos, a clientele of foreigners who have very little in the way of attachment to your country's traditions, it's much easier to get left-wing politics, particularly in its modern form, because left-wing politics today isn't really about solidarity with the working man anymore. It's about weaponizing identity-based grievances. If you have more and more of those people in your country, you can better market your politics, your electoral politics, to their felt grievances and preferences as tribal subcultures. Is there any reason to suggest in Ireland that one of the reasons why left-wing parties favour this form of replacement migration is because it benefits them politically and electorally?
I think it's quite dynamic in that the justifications for migration, the motivations of politicians are shifting all the time. Mm-hmm. It often depends on which side of the bed they get out of on a given day. Is it an economic argument? Is it a culturally enriching? Is it, as we've seen in Britain and the rest of Europe, the goalposts are constantly shifting depending on the sort of what is de rigueur at the time. There is definitely reason to believe that the Irish establishment view migration as a kind of correcting mechanism for Irish cultural homogeneity, or what they might see as a sort of provincialism of having a relative monoculture of a Gaelic Catholic tradition. So I think that and then the sort of social re-engineering that you might be alluding to often is smuggled in afterwards, as if migration is a sort of Trojan horse. So Leo Varadkar recently, a few years ago, said to the Dáil, which is the Irish Parliament, that the Irish civil service and various other parts of the government were too white. Your viewers might remember...
We've heard that before, yes.
Yes, and a certain Scottish politician doing the same thing. And so it's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, really. If you import people from around the world and various cultures that, have claims to grievance or oppression, then the sort of etiquette of race relations and the whole industry that comes with that is often, written in the small print and then paid for by the Irish public, which it is being to the tune of many millions at the moment.
One quick point on that, actually, and this is a phrase that's trotted out by Conservative politicians too, Michael Gove, Kenny Badenoch and the like. Diversity is our strength in that context is a slur against the native populations of Europe and the UK, because implicit in that is that cultural homogeneity is weak and pathetic and requires the central government to change the demographics to correct it. And so whether or not they get out the side of the bed of economics or of culture, in all cases, the statement that migration is necessary implies that if left to their own devices, homogenous populations are defective in and of themselves. And I think that is something that needs to be properly framed, because if people understand that the ruling political class have that contempt for them, I think you will see the continued acceleration of support hemorrhaging away from these parties.
Yes, I mean, diversity is our strength only if you haven't read the work of Robert Putnam at Harvard, who's shown that by every metric that you would care to name, diversity makes life much harder for community cohesion. People are much less willing to put into a welfare state. If you look at how people vote with their feet, there's often not only white flight, but flight of other minorities once different groups move into their neighborhoods. You think about the Jews in New York, for example.
Or in Malmö. In Malmö, Sweden.
Yes, exactly. Or the Jews leaving France on account of the anti-Semitism from primarily North Africans and their progeny there. So
Asians in San Francisco. I mean, there was the hashtag in 2020, Stop Asian Hate, relating to COVID, and it died a death when people realized the videos of the perpetrators of those attacks were not quite as white as Hamza Yusuf would have hoped.
There we go. And you can even find an example if it's necessary, just includes white people. So if you were to ask the Bostonians, the Protestant community in Boston, which was really a thriving center of, sort of waspy North American culture in 1810, did the arrival over the next 30 years of Irish people to that community, strengthen their culture, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who would have thought that. In fact, 50% of them no longer lived there after 30 years. And so that community was completely decimated and was never the same. And so it really often doesn't matter about skin color or anything else. It's the force of the pace, the scale, and the cultural difference is in 9 cases out of 10. If you've got high numbers, coming into a relatively cohesive community is devastating.
And this is why what we've been talking about it helps to explain why, like the variety of factors to which we've been pointing, helps to explain. All of this helps to illustrate as well that you don't need to be some kind of swivel-eyed conspiracy theorist to go along with the idea that there is clearly an agenda of replacement migration afoot in the West, because you don't need to point to a single guiding intelligence or one person or a kind of moustache-twirling cabal of people who are plotting this. There can be a congruence of interests which begin from different places yet converge onto the same space with the same policy consequences and with the same kind of I would use the word ethnocidal consequences that Connor talks about there. Like if you kind of throw it in with, you've got venal business elites who are addicted to cheap labour and that's why they support it. You've got these, what Eric Kaufman would call these kind of left modernist types who are kind of not overtly in favour of weaponising the presence of immigrants for race communism or racial identity politics, as the far left race communists are, but nevertheless think that it's much more jazzy to have a mixture of cultures within a certain domain. So you've got kind of the venal business elites, the left modernists, and then you've got the kind of full-blown race communists, all starting from different premises and all inhabiting fundamentally different moral universes and exhibiting different personal interests, and yet the consequences result. And I think that if we think of replacement migration as an emergent phenomenon in that way, rather than as a kind of top-down planned one, it's very useful and it helps us get off the hook from accusations of being excessively paranoid.
I think there's one thing missing from that as well, that is just the sort of intractable reality of international migration flows once they get going. Once you have a sort of a beachhead, as it were, of people from a certain community, that's really where you're attracting the high agency individuals, because if they arrive somewhere and they've got no community support, or they've got nobody who they can take refuge with, then that's a very difficult process. There's a lot of friction involved there. But once those communities are established, it becomes so easy to just keep the numbers coming in. And with all the will in the world, you could even have a government that's semi-serious about stopping this. It's extraordinarily difficult as well. And so there is just that sheer
chain migration.
Yes, and the same goes with the migrant gangs as well. Once that business model is up and going, and Immigration Inc., as it were, all of the various people profiting from mass illegal migration, it's again very difficult. The onus is on the countries to then implement measures to stop that they might be reluctant to do for human rights reasons or whatever. And so while you're right, there are some positive motivations to this, there are also just some things that we're now unwilling to do.
Yes. So the once the process is underway, the bar that we need to get over in order to stop it in its tracks is much higher than it was at the beginning of the process in the first place. I would grant that as well. Do you think that the Irish history of mistreatment at the hands of the British gives them a special feeling of moral indignation at the way in which they're being treated by their elite, which is slightly lacking here? Because even though I wouldn't argue that this is just, in Britain there is a stronger feeling. It's easier to weaponize guilt among the British at having dominated the modern world for so long and having civilized all these places. Like the horror of it hardly bears speaking about. Whereas in Ireland, I imagine a lot of Irish people are surprised why their own supposedly proud nationalistic parties are not a little bit more sympathetic to their concerns about demographic change.
Sure. Yes, you're right to say the British were told that they owed a duty of care to their former colonial subjects, and that pattern we saw across other countries in Europe as well. Whereas the Irish have a very different conception of their history. They fought a bloody struggle for their sovereignty, which really, if you look at Eamon de Valera's vision for the country, was an autarky with a sort of ethno-state run by where the moral domain was run by the Catholic Church. And so it bears very little resemblance to what the sort of woke technocracy that we see today. They definitely have that sense that there are parallels between the, say, some activists or some people who are very affected by mass migration make these parallels between the Plantation of Ireland and where 2/3 of Irish land was handed over to mainly Scottish and English Protestants
in the 17th century.
Yes, and the massive transfer of land and wealth that we're seeing now away from the native Irish to foreigners once again. And the analogy, like any metaphor, isn't perfect, but there are some interesting parallels in that this is the greatest intergenerational wealth transfer away from Irish people to foreigners probably since then. And so, people are rightfully, I think, perturbed by that. That does, especially with the working class areas who would be very Republican and would have, lionized the martyrs of 1916, etc. They see the EU as the new Britain under the cosh of this empire that is very aloof from the concerns of ordinary people in down at heel areas in Dublin and rural Ireland. They see the migrants as a kind of new plantation, and they, I suppose, that puts them in the role of the budding revolutionaries. And so you often hear some, it's too soon to tell, but what sounds like hyperbolic language about honouring the fallen martyrs and fighting back against this. And I think that might be why you've seen that legacy might be why you've seen some more robust and sometimes violent protests in Ireland that we didn't necessarily always have here.
If you pursue the analogy between the forms of Scottish plantation migration facilitated by James I in the early 17th century in Northern Ireland further, it becomes even more disconcerting in a way because, of course, Protestant Scots are much more culturally proximate to Irish Catholics than the sorts of people who are being imported into Ireland today. That's one reason to be concerned. And the second reason to be concerned is...
We've just got over a centuries-long sectarian
exactly, that's the point.
And what should we do? It's almost like they got bored and they thought, well, let's have some ingredients for a round two.
Yes, if
this time it's not a schism within Christianity. It's a
full-blown crusade.
Yes,
on domestic soil.
I mean, if an ethno-religious struggle, centuries-long ethno-religious struggle, can be precipitated by such culturally proximate forms of immigration 400 years ago, then think what the long-term second-order consequences of these forms of immigration are going to be. It's amazing that people are incapable of putting two and two together.
And it's not even something that we need to stretch our imaginations very far to see, because the data is in.
Yes.
This is what's so remarkable about the situation in Ireland, is that all one needs to do is survey Malmo or parts of Holland that are now run by the Moroccan mafia, or parts of France where we're seeing these pockets of lawlessness.
Yes.
And cultural separatism, positive animosity towards the dominant culture. That there's really not a country in Europe that has flirted with mass migration that hasn't had this happen. And this is one of the great ironies of the Irish situation, is that the Irish elite take great pride in their membership of the European community, but they seem to have ignored all of the signal lessons from mass migration. that community has to offer. And so from where I've been sitting, Ireland resembles the sort of last car in a pile-up crash that is just driving full pelt ahead into a heap of mangled metal.
Okay, right. So we'll cut that bit out.
I've obviously shocked him
Very
with
good,
that
Mr.
analogy. He's going to be clutching his pearls.
Do you know what's hilarious about that as well? I was about to do a very smooth segue into the next topic.
And that's going behind the members area.
Yeah, the blooper reel. There you go. You've got our 5 minutes then. Just 30 seconds of that, and then they can just laugh for the rest of it. Okay. You and I were actually in Ireland fairly recently, and one of the things is it was my first time there. We should say for viewers as well that you are also, I think ethnically, what are your Irish? What's your Irish connection again?
I'm fully Irish. My parents are both from Ireland.
There you go. Yes, yes. Despite your kind of plummy baritone
Yes.
of an accent. Okay, yeah. So we were there recently, and one thing that I found interesting about this is that you have done a documentary for the Telegraph, I believe, about Israel as well. And Israel divides opinion among the Irish. Israel-Palestine divides opinion among the Irish in a way that I haven't seen in other Anglosphere countries. And I think that's because many people, and we were even having dinner, if you recall, with one of them, many people in Ireland see themselves, given the Irish history of struggle, as identifying with the Palestinian struggle, and Israel is sort of treated more as Britain, and the Palestinians are treated more as the Irish, and it's even quite common to see this reflected in. You'll often see an Ulster flag and an Israeli flag, and you'll see an Irish tricolor and a Palestinian flag. These things seem to go together in Ireland. What's your view of that, and what was the impetus behind your documentary?
I think when you're a country like Ireland or Scotland, who a big part of your national identity is defined in opposition to a sort of oppressor or an empire, whatever it may be, then you tend to view the world, the sort of template through which you construct meaning in the world tends to be very reliant on that dynamic. Mm-hmm. And so in the same way as people are making analogies with the plantation and immigration, I think that many Irish people instinctively view the Israel-Palestine conflict as a kind of recapitulation of Britain and Ireland's struggle. Mm-hmm. And initially, when Israel seemed like the underdog and it was surrounded by Arab states that tried to do it no good on several occasions. Probably a euphemism
to put it lightly. Yes.
Tried to annihilate it several times over the last 100 years. I think many people in Ireland had more sympathy for Israel because they saw them as the David versus the Goliath, but that has now flipped. They see the Palestinians as the underdog.
Can I just insert very quickly? I think this is one of the lasting achievements of Arafat's legacy. Before Arafat was a mainstream figure in the international scene, if you read most newspaper accounts of the Middle East, it was always Israel Arab. The Israelis versus the Arabs, and everyone's natural instinct for the underdog, as you're talking about, kicks in, given this kind of small stage enshrouded by an Arab sea. But he made that discourse much more one about Israel versus Palestinians, and I think that was one of his accomplishments, leaving everything else to one side, of course.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And a lot of the PLO terrorists who would have worked with him were of a kind of Marxist, anarchist, far left sympathy, and so there would have been a lot of common ground with Irish Fenians and socialists of that ilk. And so I think that they sort of labour under this misimpression that the conflicts are analogous, and I think it saves them having to really do the unsexy work of having to pick up a book or really understand it. And that might sound harsh, but there really is a staggering level of ignorance about the history of Israel and, to be honest, the history of Jews in the 20th century in Ireland. And I think that there's several ways in which the analogy doesn't fit, but ultimately the IRA were engaged in a land dispute where they could, some of the more extreme elements of the IRA were certainly trying to had genocidal ambitions towards Protestants, but nothing like the level that we see with Hamas. And so for Israel to negotiate in the same way as Britain did with Ireland, it would be almost like sort of horse trading of how many Jews are you willing to kill.
Yes.
And another big thing is that Ireland decided in the 1920s that an imperfect state, a partition state, was better than no state at all. Whereas consecutive Palestinian leaderships over the last near 100 years now, since 1937, have come to the opposite conclusion, to the great detriment of their people. The list goes on, but many Irish people, I think, are more comfortable with viewing themselves as on the side of the angels, on the side of the oppressed. And you see this slight fetishization of the underdog in Irish songs, the IRA ballads, etc.
Does your documentary go into some of this, or is it primarily concerned with the present war?
Well, we wanted to hear from Israelis across the country why they're fighting, what they see the stakes of this war as being. And a part of that was to see how they felt about the international opprobrium that they've been getting around the world. And so that was a part of the reason for making the film, to sort of address this gulf between international opinion on Israel and what the actual Israelis think they're fighting for. And it was very interesting. You'll hear people in London and Ottawa and Toronto chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and then you meet the people who would be viciously murdered in that scenario, who actually live near those rivers, live near that sea. And you just see the look in their eyes of incomprehension. They're living in a different universe.
I wrote an essay recently for Ryan Hersey Ali's outlet, Courage Media, which commented on the discourse that was surrounding Tucker Carlson's interview with Daryl Cooper, a history podcaster, who said Churchill was the chief villain in World War II. And lots of people had an antibody reaction to that because obviously our history, our heritage is denigrated many times over. And Churchill is very much an avatar of Britain in the post-war era. But I then tried to tell people, well, look, there are certain things that are holding Britain back from being able to deal with its migration problem that aren't holding Israel back, for example. And looking at Israel's ability to defy international institutions which have been corrupted from within, which were set up in the aftermath of the Second World War to make Germany and France play nice, like the United Nations, or them ignoring the International Court of Justice because the South Africans have absolutely no moral charge to say, well, you're conducting a genocide while they're, putting Julius Malema in power. The Israelis' model of sort of tribal identity, of ethnic and religious consciousness, their high GDP per capita, their high birth rates, and their ability to defend their people might be a model for us to reassert our national identity. In the same way that people were saying Ireland might be a model, not for its violent protests, but in ridding itself of Varadkar and winning those two political referendums, might be a model to push back against mass immigration. Did you see lessons that can be learned from your time in Israel that we could take away as a side of the political aisle that's interested in defending our history, our heritage, our culture?
Yes. I think that Israel is the only country in the Western world that has managed to square the circle of being a hyper-modern society which produces some of the best technological advancements in the world, but maintaining their sense of culture and their religiosity, if not a belief in a god, at least the traditions that accompany that religiosity, which I think goes a long way to keeping that sense of what they're fighting for in their mind's eye at all times, because it's not a sort of abstract thing like, say, British values that we're told so much about. It's made tangible in every Friday night when they sit for dinner, with the various festivals that they engage in, and I think that another thing is if you live in an environment where there's a sort of higher mortality salience, there's a reminder on a daily basis in the Levant that you might come into a rocket, or you might have to go into a shelter. And again, that keeps in your mind's eye this sense of how precious life and your civilization is, which I think we've lost slightly. We've lost touch with we've relegated death really to sort of care homes and movies, and we don't have that great Irish tradition of the open casket wakes. So we get that very visceral experience of what it's like to see a loved one go cold, and I think that Israel is. Probably need a sociologist or a philosopher to give you a full answer, but there seems to be a combination of factors that means that Israelis are reproducing themselves, which is the most remarkable thing, because no other Western country is.
I definitely think that key parts of the explanation will be many of the things you're saying, like that dual sense of national identity, which is very strong. The very salient role that the Holocaust still plays in the minds of Jewish people in the post-war era, and combine that as well. And with those two things obviously combined, because the very idea is that the nightmare of the Shoah happened not just because Gentiles behaved in certain ways towards Jewish people, but because Jewish people didn't have a state of their own. So there's this kind of fear of being in exile. There is this fear of statelessness, which means that you have to do the requisite things necessary to hold on to those valuable things. And so there's not just this obsession with rights. There is that value accorded to rights in Israel, but there is also a monumental emphasis on the duties necessary to maintain the social order, which make rights, as opposed to lack of rights, possible.
Indeed.
In the first place.
As you'll know, Harrison, Edmund Burke said that society is a contract between, or a compact between the dead, the living, and the soon to be born. And I think that Israelis really feel that.
Yes.
In that, the dead are the people, in the rubble of 20th century Jewish history, who are their gaze is still very much felt in Israel, because obviously Israel was meant to be a solution to the problem of Jewish statelessness and the precariousness of their existence, and so I think they feel that very acutely. And of the people to be born, they don't want to drop the vase and say, well, we were bequeathed this opportunity for life and liberty, and we're now going to leave you in a worse state.
Yes. And the point that I would want to stress to people who understand that and understand the intuitive moral appeal of Zionism, but who are not themselves Jewish, and that's most Gentiles in the European world today and in the Western world today. Most people understand the moral case for Zionism pretty well, and most people support it, in our countries at least. But what I would want to get across to those people is that they're considerably more casual about their own countries in many cases, and I would want to urge them to bear in mind that there is nothing about being non-Jewish that makes you immune to the bad consequences of statelessness. I mean, statelessness is no more desirable for us, and I think that needs to be foremost in our minds as we face a very a century in which we're going to be very much up against it as members of our respective nations in Europe and North America.
Well, as the French novelist Michel Houellebecq said in his marvelous book Submission, when Jews were fleeing France due to anti-Semitic attacks.
It's his girlfriend who says, "I'm going to go to Israel."
Yes.
And then he responds, I forget the name of the character, but he responds,
I have no Israel.
Exactly. Precisely. Well, listen, Michael, it's been a pleasure having you on the programme. We're going to do a quick 5-minute section for our members. But for now, thank you very much indeed for coming on. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching the programme. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.